Charlie's Raven by Jean Craighead George, read by permission from the Scholastic Publishing Company. And this is chapter 16, The Perfect Round Stone. During the night, new snow fell, and Grandma Sally put off her trip to Jackson again. When Jerry arrived in his snowplow, Charlie asked to go back to town with him. The errant course of the snowplow from cabin to cabin, little town to ranch, was just the zigzag trek his new experiment required. Blue Sky had come in for breakfast, and when Charlie let him out, he flew to the big cottonwood tree. There he preened his feathers as if this were any weekend day. He was content. He did not fly south to the river bottoms or to the nearby sagebrush flats to hunt. But when Charlie climbed into the cab of Jerry's snowplow, Blue Sky took off. He flapped hard over the yard, over the trees, and glided west toward Morton. At Sagebrush Flat Roads, Jerry turned east and headed for the little town. Good, thought Charlie, who was lying on the broad space between the front seats, peering through the rear window for blue sky. On either side of the road, the big mammals were declaring winter, although the ravens were calling spring. A herd of bison was huddled in a spot blown free of snow. The mule deer were eating aspen twigs instead of grass. When Jerry turned into a horse rancher's property to plow his lane, Charlie jumped from the cab. A raven was circling low above the road. Ha, he said to himself, I'm right, and focused his binoculars on the bird's leg. There were no bands. It was not Blue Sky. Ah, nuts, he said. I don't know anything about ravens. I'm giving the drum back to Flying Cloud. Discouraged, Charlie sat on the top rung of the fence rail, which was still above the snow, and wondered what he should do now. A great horned owl called. Another answered. That means spring's here in the owl and raven world, he mused. They'll be nesting soon. They'll all be quiet, and I'll never learn where Blue Sky goes. Jerry came back to the road, stopped the snowplow, and picked up Charlie. He scrambled back up on the ledge between the front seats. Then he took up his scientific vigil, looking for Blue Sky. The snowplow rumbled down the road on the south side of Bison Butte. Charlie looked for mountain sheep posed against the skyline and wolf tracks coming down from the snowy crags. There were none, only snow and sky. Mighty lonely out here, he said. Except for that bird above the cab, Jerry replied. What bird? It's black, a raven or a crow. I catch sight of it now and then in the rearview mirror. Is it your pet? Wow, maybe. Could you drive on for a short distance, then stop suddenly? Asked Charlie. Maybe the bird will keep going when you stop. He slid into the passenger seat and stared out the front window. When the snowplow halted, a raven flew on, as Charlie suspected it might. It circled and came back. Charlie saw the red band flash. Scallywag, he shouted. So that's how you travel to and from town without being seen. What are you talking about? Jerry asked. I'm talking about my raven pal, Blue Sky. Jerry laughed. You Carlyles are quite a clan. You're all really into nature. I know your uncle, the one who studies the cutthroat trout. You can't keep him out of a stream. And I saw your granddad nearly walk off a curb looking at some bird. Yeah, said Charlie. Want me to follow the raven? Jerry asked. He follows us. You can go on to town. I know what I wanted to know. My raven stays out of sight above the truck or snowplow or whatever I'm in when I travel to town and back. That's why I've never seen him, and that's why he appears out of nowhere at Granddad's ranch house. He's right there when I get there. Now, to find out where he goes to get food in town, Charlie wrote in his notebook. When they reached the middle school, Charlie got off the snowplow and Blue Sky flew into a dense stand of spruce trees. Charlie called hello to him, ran to the school steps, and dropped by the principal's office to tell him why he was 3 days late. The principal told him he wasn't the only one and waved him off to class. As Charlie was listening to one of his classmates read a Gary Snyder poem, he noticed a large flock of ravens descending on the dumpster behind the school cafeteria. School leftovers, he said to himself, so I do lead him to food. When school was out, Charlie checked out the dumpster. The ravens were all gone. All but one. A single handsome individual sat on the school warm ventilator pipe, his head lifted high, his horns up. Charlie thought he must be Blue Sky, but his pantaloons covered his leg bands. Charlie decided to walk home to see if this fellow followed him. Did you catch that alliteration? Fellow followed him. All along the way he stopped, looked up, walked, stopped, but he did not see one raven in the 20 minutes it took to get to his home at the foot of Snow King Mountain. "But I know you're there, Blue Sky," he said, and sat on his porch to wait for him to show himself. The next door neighbor, Mrs. Crawford, stepped out on the patio and called to her cat, a wild thing that came and went around the neighborhood, making a living where it could. She put down a large bowl of cat food and went back inside. Charlie thought Mrs. Crawford might have scared away Blue Sky, and he set off to make a circuit of the neighborhood, searching trees and housetops for him. A few house sparrows were sheltered under eaves, but he saw no ravens. After dinner, he went to the room he shared with Andy and took out his homework. Presently, some intuitive sense got him up out from his chair into his window. He picked up his binoculars and looked down on the patio. A raven was finishing off the cat food. He wore a red band on his leg. Charlie ran downstairs and dialed the phone. Grandma Sally answered, then put Granddad on. "Granddad," Charlie said, trying to be calm and professional, "I know where Blue Sky goes during the week." "Tell me." "To school and then to my house. He follows me." He paused. "And so, Granddad, I know what I am to Blue Sky." "Tell me." "His wolf." What does that mean? Do you guys remember the legend in here where it talks about the wolf? Granddad was quiet for a long pause. "That's a wonderful thing to be." "I know I shouldn't say this," Charlie went on, "but ravens are uncanny. Every now and then they let a person see their magic. I am one of those persons." "Hang on to that," Granddad said. "You're close to the perfect round stone." "Ah, come on. What are you trying to tell me?" "You'll see." "Well, I see this. I am Blue Sky's wolf," Charlie said. "That's my perfect round stone." "Keep looking," said Granddad. "Tell me, what do you lead him to?" "The dumpsters at my school and Mrs. Crawford's cat food at home." He could hear Granddad chuckle. "Maybe that's why ravens like people," he said. "We've been leading them to food since we clobbered the first mammoth." "By the way," said Granddad, "was Pinecone among that team of ravens?" "I didn't see her." Then Charlie quickly added, "Have we finished the study? Can I write it up?" "We still don't know where the young ravens go that don't follow you. Keep looking. And by the way, when you come out tomorrow, bring a ½ pound of 2-penny nails and wood glue. It's fix-it time." "Does that mean you're better?" "I'll feel a whole lot better when I fix Grandma's windowsill that the porcupine chewed and stopped her grumbling." During the winter months and right up to April, Blue Sky followed his boy wolf by flying back and forth from town to ranch. At the end of the first week of April, when the sage grouse were strutting to impress the hens with their eligibility as mates, and the ground squirrels were up and about, Blue Sky changed his routine again. On April 9th, he did not come to Granddad for greetings and breakfast, even when Charlie was there. Instead, he sat on the roof ridge. He lifted his head feathers into a bonnet. He puffed out his throat and pantaloon feathers. He held his head high. On April 10th, another raven flew into the cottonwood tree and perched within sight of him. Blue Sky did a graceful black flip and roll and flew to her side. They stepped close to each other. Blue Sky trilled and his friend knocked. This went on for a long time. Charlie watched and wondered. So if we were in class, I would definitely ask you to give your opinion or predict, what is Blue Sky doing? And so Charlie's asking too, were they mates? Blue Sky was too young. It would be another year or so before he was old enough to breed. Could the female be Pinecone? He took a good look through Granddad's spotting scope. No bands. Since the new bird was not Pinecone, Blue Sky and this perky raven must be school sweethearts. He thought that sounded good, so he wrote it in his journal. Blue Sky quirked and curled and made noises like people talk. "I hear you, Blue Sky. I know what you're saying. You're telling me goodbye." "Write it down!" And the two ravens flew away. Charlie ran to Granddad. "He talked to me. Blue Sky talked to me. He said goodbye. I know he did. He's gone." "He might have also said he'd come back. Young ravens are recruiters. When one finds a carcass, the resident adults attack it so ferociously it can't eat. So what does the youngster do? He goes out and recruits dozens of its peers and brings them back. The adults can't fend off an army, so they give up and let the juveniles eat. So if you noticed in that chapter, you could have used context clues to figure out. If you didn't know, first of all, what the word recruiter meant, Granddad goes on to describe how a young raven will go out and recruit or gather other ravens to come back so that they can scare off the adults and get the food. Good. That means Blue Sky might come back. That's what I'm hoping. Granddad looked somewhat smug. I have another experiment going, he said. I asked the park nationalist if he would leave roadkill in the sagebrush in front of my house, he said and grinned. There's an elk there now. It's working like a charm. Come look. Charlie peered through the spotting scope Granddad had set up. 2 ravens were sitting on the carcass. Cool, said Charlie. Who are the 2 birds? Must be adults. I haven't seen young raven activity yet, Granddad said. Those 2 drive away any ravens that approach the carcass. They're bundles of fury. They must be the Bison Butte pair, said Charlie. That carcass is on their territory. I would say so for that very reason. Unbeknownst to Charlie and Granddad, Blue Sky's mother had laid her first egg of the new season in the same nest, in the same pine on Bison Butte. Only an army could force her and her mate to share the food on their territory now. And that's just what happened. When Granddad and Charlie were talking, 20 or so young ravens came from the east, sailing over the house and alighting on the sagebrush bushes around the elk carcass. Charlie looked through the scope. They were led by Blue Sky. The Bison Butte adults did not dare defend their food. They took one look at the mob of juveniles and let them approach the carcass. It was an iffy permission. The juveniles hopped toward the food and jumped back when the adults looked at them. They sidled up to the carcass, then nervously flew away. Finally, the adults were overwhelmed by their numbers. They stopped lifting their horns and displaying their throat shackles to scare them off. And all settled down to eat. Granddad took out his notebook. A lesson for mankind, he wrote. Ravens battle, but do not kill their own kind. While Charlie was staring at the raven show, he heard that the rhythmic beat of horse hoofs and remembered that Mr. Spender had telephoned he'd be returning to his ranch in April. Charlie waited to hear the kee-kee-kee alarm of the ravens when they saw their enemy. They did not call. The hoofbeat stopped in Granddad's yard. The ravens kept eating. Then a few young birds, having had their fill, flew onto Granddad's tree. One sat low in a pine. It stared curiously at Mr. Spender's horse. Charlie heard a knock and opened the door. Hi-ho, Charlie! Al Spender stood there. Still no alarm cry from the ravens. Something had changed. I've got news that will make you and your granddad feel good. He stepped across the threshold. Ravens are great. Charlie was completely taken back. He did not expect to hear that. Then he remembered what Singing Bird had said on the night of the teepee festival. Blue Sky is curing Granddad. Flying Cloud has cured Mr. and Mrs. Spender. Mr. Spender had changed, not the ravens. He was now friend, not enemy. Charlie and Grandma Sally welcomed him, but he hurried past them and went straight to Granddad. He still wasn't very gracious. Will, he said, you think you have stories to tell? Well, so do I. He pulled up a chair and loosened his bolo tie. Charlie and Grandma Sally stepped far enough into the room to hear. After I left the teepee festival, Mr. Spender began, I felt eerie. I felt as if something had been washed out of me. My fear of ravens seemed to be gone. Charlie's eyes widened. Mr. Spender went on. I left Sagebrush Flats and joined my brother in the house on a tree farm that I told you about. He was all upset. Our investment was in peril. The trees were infested with an outbreak of army cutworms. They could kill the forest in a season. We had an expert come. He advised us to cut and burn. We had other experts advise us to spray. We didn't know what to do. Granddad was nodding as if he'd expected to hear this. Mr. Spender went on. While we were debating, 3 ravens came to the woods. They looked around, made funny trilling noises, and went away. My brother went for his gun. I called your son Chris and asked him what to do. Nothing, he said. Then the very next day, hundreds, maybe thousands of ravens came to our trees. The forest was black with them. My fear of ravens returned wholesale, and I agreed with my brother to shoot everyone and plead economic hardship. Then I saw what they were eating. Cutworms by the millions and probably billions. We waited and watched. They came day after day until it seemed every cutworm in that forest was gone. You guys are right. They're nice birds, and I'm not afraid of them anymore. Okay, I really hope that there's like exciting light bulbs going off in your head about another story, another connection of when birds came and ate bugs and saved something. In our Utah history, when we talked about the pioneers and their crops and all the crickets were eating up all of their crops, and the seagulls came and ate and ate and ate and cleared out the crickets and saved the crops. We have another example of birds saving the trees here. So I love that there's text-to-text connections and text-to-history connections and text-to-Utah connections. So very cool. So Mr. Spender is not afraid anymore. Do you know why you were afraid of them, Granddad asked. Yeah, I do, Al Spender said. When I was little, I visited some relatives in Maine. There were ravens there. They threw pine cones at me. My uncle told me they were evil and would pick out my eyes. I was terrified. I still think they're supernatural, rounding up hundreds of their kind and coming to my forest to clean out the cutworms like they did. But I don't think they're evil anymore. And that's the scientific fact I wanted to tell you. He rose to leave. Thank you, said Granddad and glanced at Charlie. A big, big score in the good column, Charlie said. Charlie walked Mr. Spender to his horse. The Raven recruits were sitting on the roof. Not one alarm was sounded. What I want to know, Charlie said when he was back with Granddad, is how the ravens know Mr. Spender has changed. Because, said Granddad, the ravens are the perfect round stone. You'll never understand them. You'll never know all there is to know about them. But like the search for the perfect round stone, you always keep looking. Why don't we understand about them? What makes the ravens the perfect round stone? Charlie asked. Granddad ran his fingers through his thin hair, then down over his chin. Do we know whether Blue Sky knew my pills were bad or that they were just pretty? Do we know why Blue Sky learned to speak English? Do we know why he tosses all the screws out of a can or pokes holes in rafts? Hungry or vindictive? We don't know. We'll never will know because the answer is in his raven mind. Are you saying I'll never find the perfect round stone because I'm not a raven? Yes, I am. Well, said Charlie, I have an answer to my project, and it is this. Ravens are neither good nor bad. Now, Granddad said, his eyes and cheeks puckered by his big smile, you are ready to do research. Charlie nodded. He now understood that scientific research was asking questions of nature and gathering information endlessly until you find the answer. It had nothing to do with good or bad. You finished your study, Granddad said, but I'll never see mine to its conclusion. You mean where young ravens go when they leave home? Charlie asked. Granddad nodded. But we know where Blue Sky goes, Charlie said. Isn't that enough? What he does isn't wild behavior. Living with us has changed him. And he's changed us, Charlie said, scratching his head as he pondered. Hey, I did do a study of the effect of the environment on people. I'm listening, said Granddad. Tell me one effect. That I know enough about ravens to try to finish your study. Granddad turned and looked out the window. To do that, he said, you need radios and expensive equipment, even airplanes. He turned back to Charlie. Unless, he said slowly, you find Pinecone, or her bands turn up in a coyote dropping, or a great horned owl casing. And that's one chance in a billion. I'll take it, said Charlie. I'm going to keep looking for that perfect round stone. Okay, that's the end of chapter 16. Stay tuned because we only have a couple chapters left.